The Vantian Accord. Tate Reyes had spent 6 years making sure nobody ever needed to say his sister's name to explain who he was. Ava Reyes had a file with a security classification above his own clearance and a reputation that reliably ended arguments before he finished a sentence. Tate had a freight license, a stubborn streak, and a very deliberate habit of taking contracts nowhere near anything that might require backup. He liked it that way. 6 years of quiet, unglamorous cargo runs along the Concordance's outer edge had taught him exactly how far a person could get on patience and a decent bribe, and exactly how little of that skill set was built for what he found on Kestrel's Drift. The Outer Rim world had no Concordance charter, no standing law beyond whatever a given docking ring's owner felt like enforcing that week, and exactly the kind of clientele that made it profitable to keep it that way. Tate had come there chasing a supply contract, the same reason half the humans on the station had come there. Earth's newly expanded fleet needed parts faster than procurement's own bureaucracy could authorize them, and the Rim's black markets didn't ask questions Earth would rather not answer either. He had not come looking for anything else. He found it anyway, in a smoke-thick pleasure den 3 docking rings deep, behind a curtain nobody had bothered to guard well enough. She was Aelith. He knew that much on sight, the pale blue silk sheen skin unmistakable even under the den's cheap red lighting, the elegant pointed ears, the kind of flawless bilateral symmetry her whole species was famous for across 100 worlds that had never once had to buy one at a counter. She could not have been older than her early 20s. The collar around her throat was dark-plated alloy, traced with a thin, dampened amber gold circuit line. Not decoration, Tate realized with a cold drop in his stomach, but a neural dampening restraint. The same design Earth's own intelligence briefings had spent the last year quietly circulating warnings about. Kalisk Dominion hardware, the kind that was only supposed to exist inside a sanctioned harvest fleet, not strapped to a girl's throat in a Rimworld brothel 3 years after the Dominion's flagship had been gutted by a woman who happened to share his last name. She looked at him the way every other patron in that room had apparently been trained to expect to be looked at, and Tate understood, with a clarity that made something in his chest go very cold and very still, that he was not going to be able to walk back out through that curtain and simply forget he'd seen her. Her name was Surreal. He learned that much before he learned almost anything else about her. Not from the men running the den, who called her by a lot number, but from her, in a voice that had clearly not expected anyone to ask. "Why do you want to know?" she said, when he finally got 5 unwatched minutes at her side, posing as a buyer serious enough to warrant privacy. "Because I'm getting you out of here," Tate said, "and I'd rather do that for a person than a lot number." She studied him for a long moment with an Aelith's unnervingly perfect composure, searching, he suspected, for the version of this conversation where it turned out to be a crueler kind of lie than the ones she was used to. She didn't find one. "Then you should know," she said finally, "that the people who own this collar do not lose merchandise quietly. They call themselves the Ash Cinder Concern now, not the Dominion. They'll tell you they answer to no Harvest Fleet and no Home Command. It does not make them any less thorough about what happens to a girl who runs. If you try this and fail, they will not simply kill you. They will make certain I watch first." He tried anyway, 3 nights later, with a forged transit manifest, a bribed dock officer, and considerably more courage than plan. It nearly didn't work. It worked anyway, in the chaotic, half-improvised way that Tate would later admit, to Cyril and no one else, had been mostly luck. A docking bay fire alarm he hadn't triggered on purpose, going off at exactly the moment he needed a crowd. An Ash Cinder enforcer distracted just long enough by the confusion to miss the freighter pulling away with its transponder already spoofed. The Ash Cinder Concern were not a subtle organization even at the best of times. Surplus Dominion hulls, surplus Dominion collars, surplus Dominion discipline, run now by officers who had slipped their own chain of command in the chaos after the tribute fell, and decided the harvest business was worth keeping even without a Dominion to answer to. The ones who ran Kestrel's Drift were considerably less subtle than most. They noticed within the hour. They came after the freighter within 2. What followed was 11 days that Tate would later describe, when Ava finally asked him to account for himself, as the longest and least professional operation he had ever run, not because the tactics were bad, but because somewhere around day 4, hiding in the cargo hold of a scrap hauler while an ash cinder patrol boat swept the debris field they were drifting through, he had looked over at Sorrel and realized he was no longer entirely certain he was doing this only to save a stranger's life. She noticed him noticing. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle," she said quietly in the dark. "I'm not a puzzle, Tate Reyes. I'm just someone who has not been allowed to choose anything about her own life in longer than I want to say out loud. And you are the first person in that entire time who has asked me what I wanted instead of telling me." "What do you want?" he asked. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. "Right now," she finally said, "just to keep being someone you ask that question." The scrap hauler bought them 2 days, not more. An ash cinder bounty cutter caught their trail again over a mining depot's asteroid field on day 6, close enough that Tate could see the collar charge indicator on Surreal's throat flicker warningly whenever the cutter's tracking beam swept near, a design flaw he hadn't known about until she told him, breathless, that the dampener drew extra power to actively jam a locator ping, which meant every near miss was quietly draining the one piece of hardware keeping her from being tracked outright. He didn't outfly the cutter, he outthought it, cutting the hauler's own running lights and drifting deadstick into the asteroid field's densest debris shadow, letting the ash cinder pilot's own collision avoidance systems do the work of losing them for him, the same trick, he'd later realize, that smugglers along this exact rim had been using against Dominion pattern sensor suites for years, because a fleet built to process harvested cargo efficiently had never once been built to hunt anything that didn't want to be found. It cost them their last working transponder and 6 hours of Surreal's hands shaking too badly to hold a ration bar. It also, for the first time since Kestrel's drift, made her laugh, short, disbelieving, real, when he surfaced from the crawlspace afterward, covered in coolant residue, and asked if that had looked as terrifying from the cockpit as it had felt from the hold. By day 9, across 3 stolen ships and 2 worlds neither of them had ever intended to see, it had stopped being a rescue and become, unmistakably, something neither of them had a tidy word for yet. He mapped her laugh the way he'd once mapped supply routes, the small, disbelieving one from the asteroid field, and the fuller one that came out on the 9th night when she finally let herself believe, for one whole quiet hour, that they might actually survive this, and told him for the first time about the Glasswind Cluster's mirrored skies, about a father who had once been warmer than the man who'd later signed the papers, letting her be sold off a debt ledger neither of them had ever fully explained to her. She learned, in turn, that he talked faster and more carelessly when he was frightened and trying not to show it, that he had a sister he loved and slightly resented for making everything look easy, and that he had started, without either of them quite noticing when it began, reaching for her hand during the parts of the run that frightened her too. Neither of them said the word love out loud yet. Both of them had already started living as though it were true. The ash cinder concern caught up with them properly on day 11, over a dead moon with no name Tate ever bothered to learn, in a firefight he was losing badly enough. Outgunned, out-armored, the stolen freighter's shields already failing under sustained energy emitter fire, that he finally did the thing his pride had been refusing to let him do for a week. He opened a priority channel to Earth and asked for his sister. Ava Reyes arrived 4 hours later at the head of a strike element from the Threshold Directorate's own quiet fleet, and did to the Ash Cinder Raiders exactly what she'd once done to the ship they'd scavenged half their hardware from. She did not negotiate. She had read the file on Kestrel's Drift's trafficking operation on the way out, in full, the way she read every file now. Cross-referenced it against 3 years of Dominion surplus black market chatter her own division had been quietly tracking since the tribute fell, and decided within the first 2 pages that this particular rogue faction had forfeited any claim to the diplomacy she generally preferred to lead with. She hit their collar-jamming relay first, the same power draw flaw Surreal had described to Tate days earlier, now weaponized as a targeting solution, dropping every dampener in the Ashcinder fleet's control radius in one coordinated strike before their gunners had finished registering what had shown up on sensors. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The Ashcinder faction that had held Surreal's collar contract did not survive it as an organization, and the handful of officers who survived the fighting itself surrendered to a woman whose reputation, in certain Rimworld circles, had already outpaced whatever they'd actually known about her going in. The one who'd ended the tribute, now here to end whatever the tribute's wreckage had spawned. "You could have led with the diplomacy," Tate said afterward, half a question. Watching his sister review the wreckage with the same unhurried calm, she reviewed everything with now. "I did," Ava said. "I diplomatically decided they didn't get a say in how this ended." She looked past him at Surreal, who was watching her with the particular attention of someone recalibrating, in real time, everything she'd assumed about what a human was capable of. "You're the one he nearly died for," Ava said. It wasn't a question either. "Good. He's an idiot, but he's my idiot, and he clearly thinks you're worth it. I'd like to hear, eventually, whether you think the same thing about him." He took her home himself, not to Earth, but to Aelith space, to the Glasswind Cluster's quiet, crystalline atmosphere worlds where her family had spent 11 days believing her dead or worse. Her parents received her with a grief-turned relief so raw that even Tate, standing carefully apart at the edge of the reunion, felt it land somewhere he hadn't expected. Her father, Lord Carol Vantian, thanked him formally, correctly, with every courtesy Aelith custom demanded of a debt this large, and did not, in the same breath or any afterward, offer him so much as a private word alone with his daughter again. Tate understood the shape of that silence well enough. He left 3 days later, without asking Surreal to come with him, and without telling her exactly how much it cost him not to. "The truest thing I can do for you," he told her in the last few minutes they had, "is let you have this, your family, your world, a life that isn't running from something for once." She did not argue with him, which he would later realize should have worried him more than it did at the time. She only said very quietly, "You have a strange definition of the truest thing," and let him go without another word, because she had already decided, somewhere in the 11 days that came before this one, that she was not finished with this particular argument, only pausing it. Tate went back to freight runs because it was the only thing he knew how to do that didn't involve sitting still with what had happened. He told himself, for the first few weeks, that the quiet was a relief. It wasn't. He caught himself, more than once, starting to say something to an empty cockpit before remembering there was no one in the co-pilot's seat anymore to say it to. Ava noticed the one time she visited between deployments and didn't say much about it beyond a single dry observation. "You've gotten worse at pretending you're fine, which I actually consider progress." And an offer, quietly made and quietly declined, to fly out to the Glasswind Cluster herself and find out how Surreal was actually doing. Tate said no. He told himself it was respect for her family's wishes. He suspected, some nights, it was closer to fear of the answer. She lasted 4 months in her father's house before the pausing ran out. Aelith courtship customs did not recognize what had happened between them as anything but a debt already paid and closed. Her mother's gentle, relentless reintroductions to appropriately matched Aelith suitors made the shape of her family's actual expectation increasingly, suffocatingly clear. A procession of composed, correct, thoroughly vetted men, each one a little more baffled than the last by how little of her attention he seemed to hold. Surreal found herself, night after night, comparing every one of them to a human who talked too fast when he was scared and had nearly died more than once, making sure she got to choose her own life, and finding, every single time, that the comparison wasn't close. She told her father as much, eventually, as gently as she knew how. He did not receive it gently. "You will not disgrace this family for an infatuation born of captivity," he told her, in a voice she had heard him use on foreign delegations and never once, before that night, on her. "What you feel for that human is gratitude wearing love's clothing, and it will pass. the way trauma always eventually does if you simply give it time and stop indulging it. She left that same week, alone, with considerably less plan than Tate had once had rescuing her, and considerably more certainty about what she actually wanted than she had ever been permitted to have in her father's house. Finding him took her the better part of 2 months, tracing a trail of quiet cargo hauling contracts and half-forgotten favors across a dozen systems, because Tate Reyes, it turned out, was considerably harder to track than any professional smuggler she'd ever read about, mostly because he wasn't hiding from anyone but himself. She finally found him on Aelith's own home system's outer moon, in a Concordance holding facility, in chains, 3 days from a formal execution her own father had personally authorized under an old clan law provision that predated the Concordance Charter and had never technically been repealed, a provision that let a wronged Aelith patriarch demand blood price from any outworlder judged to have irreparably damaged his family's honor. Concordance law be damned. Lord Carol Vantian had traced the same rumors his daughter had, arrived considerably faster with considerably more resources, and decided, in the same voice he'd once used to tell his daughter her love would pass with time, that the cleanest way to end this particular embarrassment was to simply end the man who'd caused it. Surreal stood in the observation gallery above the execution chamber and watched her own father prepare to have the man she loved killed under a law he'd resurrected specifically for the purpose and understood, with a clarity that felt less like a realization than something she'd simply been refusing to look directly at for 4 months, that the home she'd grown up believing was civilization itself had never actually been so different from the collar she'd worn on Kestrel's Drift. Just quieter, better dressed, and considerably more convinced of its own righteousness, while it decided, without asking her, exactly what shape her life was permitted to take. "I did not travel 2 months and a dozen systems," she told her father, stepping into the chamber itself, in a voice that had none of the careful deference she'd spent her whole life speaking to him in, "to watch you finish the argument you refuse to actually have with me." "This is not your argument to finish," Lord Vantian said. "This is a debt of honor between his life and this family's name, and it does not require your permission." "Then you have already lost it," Surreal said, "because I choose him. Not out of gratitude, not out of the trauma you told me I would eventually grow out of. I choose him the way I have never once, in my entire life, been permitted to choose anything for myself. And if you execute him for that choice, you will not be defending this family's honor. You will simply be proving, in front of everyone in this chamber, that everything he risked his life to save me from was never actually unique to the Ash Cinder concern at all. You would just be a quieter version of the same caller." What followed was not a fight either of them had trained for, exactly, but was a fight all the same. Surreal placed herself bodily between her father's honor guard and the chains holding Tate, refusing 3 separate orders to stand aside, until Lord Vantian himself finally crossed the chamber floor to physically move her, and found, for the first time in his daughter's entire life, that she would not simply yield to him the way Aelith daughters were raised to yield. He caught her wrist. She twisted free of the hold with a sharpness that startled the guards more than it startled her, and put herself squarely back between him and the man in chains. "Strike me down first, then," she told her father, close enough now that only he could hear it. "Because I have already decided I would rather die beside him than live the rest of my life inside a house that taught me my own choices were never actually mine to make." Lord Vantian stood there, blade still, staring at a daughter who had never once in 20-some years given him reason to doubt she would eventually, obediently, come around, and found, for the first time, that he genuinely did not know how this particular confrontation ended, because the only version he could imagine now cost him something he had never actually been willing to pay. It was not honor that broke first. It was the father. "Release him," Lord Vantian said, so quietly the guards nearly missed it, and then, louder, because some part of him needed everyone in that chamber to hear him say it once, plainly, before he could fully believe he'd meant it. "Release him." I would rather have a daughter who defied me and lived than a family name defended by a chamber that took her reason for living out of it." He looked at Tate for a long, unreadable moment. Not warmly, not yet, perhaps not ever entirely, and said only, "I am told you nearly died for her more than once. I am now asking you not to make that a habit if this family is to survive having you in it." It was not quite a blessing. It was, Surreal understood, watching her father's shoulders finally lower for the first time in the entire encounter, considerably closer to one than she had any right to expect from him 3 minutes earlier. They were married on a quiet Aelith world 6 months later, in a ceremony that borrowed customs from 2 species that had never quite had a wedding rite built for exactly this combination before, and would not be the last of its kind. Ava Reyes stood beside her brother as the officiant read vows in a language half the room only partially understood, and reflected, watching Tate's face as Surreal walked toward him, that some debts really were only ever the first signature, and some accords were never going to be written down in any concordance charter at all. Only lived, one deliberately chosen day at a time, by 2 people who had both, in their own very different ways, finally learned exactly what it costs to choose something for themselves. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.